On the afternoon of December 13th, 2001, 35-year-old Tracey Roberts was making tea in the kitchen of her beautiful two-story Victorian-style house in the rural town of Early, Iowa. Tracey's husband, Michael, had been out of town on business for a week, so Tracey had been on her own, taking care of her 3 kids, and she felt like she'd barely had a moment to breathe. But now, her 11-year-old son was at school, and her 3-year-old son and baby daughter were both napping, so she finally had a minute to herself. The teapot whistled, so Tracey grabbed a tea bag, put it in her cup, and poured in the hot water. Then she poured in some milk, grabbed a spoon to stir it with, and sat down at the kitchen table. But before she could even take a sip, there was a knock at the door. Tracey shouted, "Come in," and then got up from the table. Tracey had spent most of her life in Chicago, Illinois, and moving from a huge city like Chicago to Early, Iowa, a town of 500 people where no one even locked their doors, had taken her a while to get used to. But after 3 years of living in Early, she'd really started to love the peace and security that came with it. Tracey walked through a large living room with hardwood floors, and when she arrived at her front door, she saw a 20-year-old man named Dustin Wade standing there. Dustin was 5 foot 7 inches tall and skinny, and he was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a brown leather jacket. Tracey said hello, and Dustin smiled. Tracey was tall with blue eyes and long brown hair, and from the moment she'd moved to Early, people in town talked about how beautiful she was. Tracey asked Dustin if everything was okay, and he said he'd come by the house because Tracey's husband, Michael, said he had some work for Dustin to do. Michael was an Australian businessman who had started his own computer security company when he moved to the US after marrying Tracey. And a year earlier, he had hired Dustin's mom to work part-time as an office manager for him. And when Michael had met Dustin, he'd taken to the shy young man almost immediately. And so Michael had started paying Dustin to do small jobs for his company, like filing and making copies. Dustin had struggled in school throughout his childhood, and even when he got older, he had trouble making friends. Doctors had diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder and said he had learning disabilities that could be the cause of his shyness. But Dustin had really started to come out of his shell when he started working for Michael and spending time with him and Tracey. Michael and Tracey had even taken Dustin paintballing with them, and it was pretty much all Dustin talked about now. Back at the front door, Tracey told Dustin that there must have been a mix-up because Michael was still out of town, and so she told Dustin to just come back the following day to see what Michael needed him to work on. Dustin thanked Tracey and then walked back outside. Tracey closed the door and then went into the kitchen and sat down to drink her tea. But just a few minutes later, there was another knock at the front door, and so Tracey figured it had to be Dustin wanting to ask her something else. And so she took a deep breath, a little annoyed she couldn't relax with her tea, and shouted, "Come in," and then headed back to the door. But it wasn't Dustin standing there this time. It was one of Tracey's friends who'd come by to drop off some Christmas cookies she'd baked for Tracey and the kids. Tracey hugged her friend and asked if she wanted to come in for a cup of tea. Since moving to Iowa, there were only a handful of people that Tracey felt like she could really talk to, and this friend was one of those people. And right now, Tracey desperately wanted to talk to this friend about what was going on in her life. Her friend said she'd love to come in for some tea, and so the two of them walked back to the kitchen. The friend sat down, and Tracey poured her a cup, and then she sat down as well. Then Tracey told her friend that she wanted to tell her a secret, something she hadn't even really told her husband. Immediately, a concerned look came across her friend's face, but Tracey didn't seem to pay attention to that. Instead, Tracey took a sip of her tea and then looked around the kitchen cautiously, like she thought someone could be listening. And then, after feeling satisfied, Tracey looked at her friend and she told her that she was scared her ex-husband might try to hurt her. Her friend's eyes went wide. She knew Tracey had been married to a doctor before she was married to Michael, but she had never heard Tracey talk much about her ex-husband. Tracey took another sip of tea, then she told her friend that her ex-husband had filed with the courts to try to get sole custody of their son, Tracey's 11-year-old. The boy was her only child with her first husband, and she said she had tried to keep things as civil as possible during the divorce for her son's sake. But now, her ex-husband was living in Virginia, and he wanted their son to leave Tracey and go live with him. As she said this, Tracey's hands began to tremble, and her spoon rattled against the side of her teacup. And then Tracey said there was no way she would ever let her son go live with his dad halfway across the country. And then, with a trembling voice, Tracey said her ex-husband was a bully, and she really worried that he might do something to try to hurt her. Tracey's friend felt so bad for Tracey, and so she got up, she walked around the table, and gave Tracey a hug. And the two women would stay in the kitchen a little longer, and they would continue to talk both about the ex-husband and just about life. But eventually, Tracey's friend had to head home, and Tracey had to check on the kids. By around 6:30 p.m. that night, Tracey had managed to push basically any thoughts about her ex-husband out of her head. And now she was focusing on the bedtime routine for her kids. And so she asked her 11-year-old to keep his little brother company while she gave the baby a bath. The two boys ran upstairs to the 11-year-old's room to watch a movie. Tracey turned off the lights downstairs to save on the electric bill, and then she carried the baby upstairs to the bathroom. Tracey started running the water, but before she was about to start giving the baby a bath, she heard the front door open downstairs, and then footsteps began to move around inside the entryway. Tracey figured Michael must have gotten home earlier than expected, so she lifted the baby up and she walked down the hall to the top of the stairs, but Michael wasn't in the entryway. Instead, two men in dark clothes were standing there looking up at her, and immediately Tracey screamed. Tracey heard the two men rush across the entryway towards the stairs, and she felt like she could barely breathe. The first floor of the house was pitch black, so she couldn't really see who the men were, but she knew they were there to hurt her and her kids. So Tracey clutched the baby close to her chest, and she yelled for her oldest son. Then she ran down the hall towards the boy's bedroom and got there just as the 11-year-old opened the door. The boy was confused and scared by his mother's screams, but Tracey didn't have time to explain. She could hear the footsteps of the men on the stairs. So she handed the baby to her son, told him to go back into the room, lock the door, and protect his brother and sister at all costs. The boy was about to cry, but he took his baby sister in his arms. He went back into his room, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as his mom said to do. Then Tracey turned around and began walking down the hallway in the direction of the stairs where these two men were originally running up. And as she walked down the hall, suddenly she felt a pair of nylon pantyhose wrap around her throat from behind, and one of these men yanked her towards him and started strangling her. Tracey was choking and kicking and trying to get free, but the pantyhose kept getting tighter and tighter around her neck. Finally, Tracey used all of her strength to launch herself forward. She broke free from this chokehold and stumbled down the hall, and her attacker fell back and lost his footing. Then Tracey ran to her bedroom at the end of the hall near the top of the stairs, and then once she went inside, she ran to the back corner of the room next to the bed, dropped down onto her knees in front of a small gun safe she and Michael kept on the floor. In the dark, Tracey punched in the code for the safe, she opened up the door and grabbed 2 revolvers from inside. And just then, she felt one of the intruders grab her legs, and she fell flat on the floor. Tracey screamed, and without thinking, she turned and pointed one of the revolvers behind her and fired off multiple shots. The gunfire flashed in the dark and smoke began to fill the room. She heard the man who was holding her legs start to groan in pain and crumple onto the floor. And she heard the other man run out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. Tracey struggled to breathe and her throat felt like it was burning, but she pulled herself to her feet, and in the dark, she could make out the shadow of the man she'd just shot. He looked like he was face down on the ground. But then the man groaned and started to stand up, so Tracey screamed again and fired the other revolver, and this time the attacker fell back onto the floor, motionless. Tracey stood in the dark bedroom, wheezing and fighting back tears. Then she called out for her 11-year-old son again. Down the hall, the boy opened his bedroom door and rushed out of his room, still holding the baby and with his little brother at his side. The children came into their mother's bedroom. Tracey put down the guns, she took the baby in her arms, and they all stood there in the dark for a minute next to this guy she had just shot. Then they all went downstairs, turned on the lights, and Tracey's oldest son went to the kitchen and dialed 911. Around 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after the 911 call was placed, Deputy Daniel Brusher of the Sac County Sheriff's Office was driving in his cruiser outside of Early, Iowa, when he got an urgent call from the dispatcher. She said there'd been a shooting in Early, but the caller had been a young boy, and she couldn't get that many details. All she knew was that 2 men had attacked the boy's mother, and the mother had managed to shoot one of the attackers. Deputy Brusher said he was on his way and told her to make sure if the ambulance got there before him that nobody went inside until police had cleared the area, because for all he knew, there might still be a shooter inside of the house. Then Brusher flipped on his sirens, hit the gas, and sped down a country road toward Tracey's house. On his way, he called for backup from the sheriff's department, local early police, and the state police. And about 10 minutes later, he arrived outside the beautiful Victorian-style home, turned off the sirens, and parked his car on the driveway behind an old white sedan. An ambulance was parked nearby, but the EMTs had heeded his warning and had not gone inside yet. Deputy Brusher took a deep breath. This type of call was not something he was used to. Break-ins and shootings just did not happen in Early. So he was nervous. But he knew at least one child, the boy who had called 911, was inside the house, so he needed to act fast and get the child to safety. Brusher stepped out of his car and felt the cold winter air against his face. He steadied himself, drew his gun, and crept towards the house. He could feel his heart beating fast, but he tried to stay calm and focused. Then, as he was approaching, he saw the front door of the house open, and he tightened his grip on his weapon. But a stunned look came across his face when he saw Tracey and her 3 kids calmly walk out of the house. Brusher yelled at Tracey for her and the kids to get behind him as fast as they could, but Tracey said the house was safe now. Brusher was obviously reassured to hear that, but he still yelled for her to get away from the door. So Tracey did as she was told, and she walked with the kids towards the deputy, and he rushed over to meet them. He saw right away there was a red bruise across Tracey's throat, but at least at first glance, she seemed okay and the kids seemed to be unharmed. Then Tracey looked at Brusher and told him that one of the men who attacked her had run off, and the other one was dead in an upstairs bedroom because she said she had killed him. Brusher told her to stay there and then signaled for the EMTs to come over and look at Tracey's injury as well as the kids. Then Brusher walked up to the front door of the house. He still wasn't sure what was going on inside, so he kept his weapon drawn, and he moved carefully and slowly. Once he was inside, he made his way up the stairs, and when he reached the hall, he could smell gunpowder in the air. And as he got closer to Tracey's bedroom, the smell got stronger. Brusher stepped into her bedroom and flipped on the light, and on the ground, he saw a man lying on his chest with his face slightly turned out. There was a wide pool of blood that surrounded the body, and it looked like it was starting to seep into the cracks of the hardwood floors. Brusher crossed the room to the body and crouched down beside it, and after feeling for a pulse and not finding one, he noticed there was a wallet in the back pocket of the dead man's jeans. So Brusher grabbed the wallet and pulled out a driver's license. He looked at the photo on the license and then held it up next to the man's face. And clearly, the license belonged to the dead man. The dead man's name was Dustin Wade, the same Dustin Wade who had been working for Tracey's husband. The scene in the bedroom totally shocked Deputy Brusher. The amount of blood on the floor and the multiple bullet wounds on the body were beyond anything he'd seen before. But he shook it off because he had work to do. There had been 2 intruders in the house, and now the other one was presumably on the run somewhere in town. Brusher contacted all levels of law enforcement in the area and let them know that one of Tracey's attackers had fled the scene and was likely in the area, but he had no physical description of the suspect. Then Brusher walked out of the bedroom, headed downstairs, and stepped outside. He walked over to one of the EMTs on the scene and asked if the kids were okay, and the EMT said none of them had been injured, at which point Brusher let out a sigh of relief. Members of the medical team were still looking over the wound on Tracey's throat, but during their medical exam, she was still able to give Brusher a more detailed account of what had happened. But when Tracey said she was still having trouble breathing, the EMTs said they needed to get her to the hospital to make sure she hadn't suffered any internal damage when she was being strangled. So Brusher told Tracey once she was feeling up to it, the police would follow up with her. Tracey thanked him, and then she and the kids got into an ambulance and headed to the hospital. At this point, members of multiple law enforcement agencies were arriving on the scene, and forensics and ballistics headed inside and got to work assessing the evidence in the upstairs bedroom where Dustin had been shot and killed. And while they did that, Brusher and officers from the sheriff's department walked the grounds to see if there were any clues that might lead them to the second attacker. But while they were searching, Brusher heard a car suddenly come screeching to a halt in front of the house. A short woman in her 40s stepped out of the car. It was Dustin's mother. She was shaking and she had a frantic look on her face, and she began yelling, "Is my son here? Is Dustin here?" Brusher walked over to Dustin's mother and tried to calm her down. He had hoped they'd have more time before word spread, but in a town that small, it was impossible to keep something like this secret for very long. Then Dustin's mother pointed at the old white sedan in the driveway. She said it was Dustin's car and she needed to know if he was there. Brusher nodded, but the look in his eyes gave something away. because immediately Dustin's mother asked if her son was dead. And in a soft voice, Brusher said yes. Dustin's mother started sobbing and wailing, and her head fell on Brusher's shoulder, and through tears, she asked if she could go inside and hold him. Brusher felt sick. No matter what had happened in that bedroom, he couldn't imagine the pain this mother was going through right now. He put his hands on her shoulders and told her he was so sorry, but she could not go inside. Then he helped her back to her car and told her that the best thing she could do right now was just go home and he would come talk to her as soon as he could. As Brusher was speaking to Dustin's mother, one of the local early police officers who knew Dustin's mother came over to talk to her as well, and after a few minutes, they had convinced her to head back home. Watching the devastated mother drive off into the night made Brusher feel like he'd stepped into another world. How could something like this have happened? Why would a young man like Dustin attack a woman in her home while she was there with her 3 young kids? Brusher hoped he could find some answers in Dustin's car, so he walked over to the white sedan. The driver's side door was unlocked, and when they opened it and looked inside, Brusher saw a pink spiral notebook in the passenger seat. He reached across the car, grabbed the notebook, opened it, and started reading, and a look of complete shock came across his face. The handwriting was sloppy, but Brusher could still make out what was written on the first page. Dustin had written out a confession saying he was going to go kill Tracey, but the attack wasn't personal. Instead, Dustin had written that he was going to murder Tracey because her ex-husband had paid him to do it. In the days following the attack, Brusher and other members of the investigative team returned to Tracey's house multiple times. They still had no information on the second attacker, and so they were desperate to find any new evidence that might point them in the direction of this second person. And when Tracey came home from the hospital, she tried to give police as many details as she could about what had happened, including trying to describe this second person, but it had been dark downstairs and dark in her bedroom, and everything had happened so fast that all she could say about the second attacker was that she thought he was maybe average height and had brown hair. That description wasn't much for police to go on, so Brusher asked Tracey about her relationship with her ex-husband. And as soon as the ex-husband came up, Tracey's entire demeanor changed. She told police about their ongoing ugly custody battle, and she said when they were married, he used to get violent with her and their son. And so after interviewing Tracey, Brusher felt like that pink notebook with the confession by Dustin was the piece of evidence that could break the entire case open, because there was direct reference to Tracey's ex-husband having set up the attempted murder, and now hearing from Tracey about this custody battle, Brusher felt like that could be the ex-husband's motive for wanting to kill Tracey. But before going after Tracey's ex-husband, who lived halfway across the country, Brusher had to make sure Dustin had really written the words in the pink notebook. So on December 18th, 5 days after the attack on Tracey, Brusher and other members of the investigative team headed to Dustin's house. They were greeted at the door and led inside by Dustin's very upset mother. The house was cold and dark. Brusher saw Dustin's father sitting in a chair, motionless and staring at the floor, and Dustin's 2 younger sisters were sitting on the couch, and it was obvious they'd been crying. Brusher apologized for bothering the family, but he said he needed their help figuring out if a note he had found was actually in Dustin's handwriting. Dustin's mother said she could help, and so she led Brusher and the others through the first floor of the house to a door that led to the basement. Then she opened that door, flipped on the light, and they began walking down a creaking staircase. And on the walk down, Brusher was thinking he had no idea what he was about to find. He wondered if Dustin had laid out plans for the attack that they would find, or if maybe Dustin had covered his walls with photos of Tracey. But when they stepped into the basement, Brusher saw that Dustin had converted it into a bedroom that any typical 20-year-old guy might have. Stacks of video games were on the floor in front of a TV, clothes were piled up in different spots, and there were a few books and video game magazines laying next to a computer. Dustin's mother looked around the room and stopped herself from crying in front of the officers. Then she crouched down and dug through a stack of papers and found a couple of pages that were filled with writing Dustin had done in high school, and she handed it to Brusher. He thanked her and then told her some of the other officers needed to check Dustin's computer to see if they could find out anything more about this home invasion, and she said she understood. And then, with just one glance at Dustin's school papers, it was obvious to Brusher that the handwriting matched the handwriting in the pink notebook where Dustin had claimed Tracey's ex-husband had hired him to kill Tracey. So the pink notebook looked like it was going to lead right to the man behind the attack, Tracey's ex-husband, and police hoped that would then lead them to the second attacker who had gotten away. But because Tracey's ex-husband lived in Virginia, investigating him was going to take some work. So law enforcement in Iowa coordinated with local and state agencies in Virginia to conduct a thorough investigation into Tracey's ex-husband that included interviews and searches of his computer and phone data, correspondence, and financial transactions. But nothing they found showed any connection between Tracey's ex-husband and Dustin. And searches of Dustin's computer and phone records didn't reveal any connection either. So no matter how investigators looked at it, there really was no evidence other than the entry in the pink notebook that suggested Dustin and Tracey's ex-husband even knew each other. And by the time the initial investigation into Tracey's ex-husband concluded, Brusher had been on the case for over a month, and he felt like he'd already hit a dead end. Police still had no legitimate lead on the second attacker, and their hopes that Tracey's ex would prove to be the man who had arranged everything had kind of fallen apart. But despite all that, nobody, including Brusher, believed that Dustin had planned the home invasion and Tracey's attempted murder on his own. They just didn't think he had the intellect or the personality to do something like that. So they needed to find out who had gotten Dustin involved and set this attack in motion. And then, in late January of 2002, about a month after Dustin died, the investigators had a simple thought. What if they were focusing on the wrong husband? Instead of Tracey's ex, what if they needed to look more closely at the person she was currently married to, the Australian businessman Michael Roberts? Right after the attack on Tracey, her husband Michael had been considered a suspect because when something like this happens, spouses are almost always suspects. But the discovery of the pink notebook had quickly shifted the investigation's focus to Tracey's ex-husband, and so Michael had not been a priority in late December of 2001 or in January of 2002. But now, with the investigation into Tracey's ex-husband going nowhere, investigators started digging deeper into Michael's background, and they found a lot of red flags. It turned out that Michael and Tracey had met through an online dating site when Michael was still living in Australia. And just 18 days after they had met, Tracey had flown to Australia and they had gotten married. And soon after the wedding, Michael had moved to the United States to be with Tracey, and they had moved to Early, Iowa together, where Michael set up his computer security business. And it was Michael's company and financial situation that really jumped out at Brusher. Because despite Michael's claims that he was this wealthy international businessman, investigators discovered that his computer security company was actually failing and Michael was facing possible financial ruin. But it looked to police like Michael had a very morbid way out of his financial mess. If Tracey died, he would receive over $1 million from her life insurance policy. With this new information, Brusher contacted Michael and said he wanted Michael to come down to the sheriff's station and take a polygraph test, which is more commonly known as a lie detector test. Michael was not sure if he wanted to subject himself to that, but Brusher told him it would help police eliminate him as a suspect. So, on February 13th, 2002, 2 months after the attack on Tracey, Michael arrived at the sheriff's station. It was cold outside, but the second Michael stepped inside, he started sweating. Brusher met Michael, thanked him for coming, and then led him down a bright hallway into a small interrogation room where 2 men were waiting, a state police investigator and the polygraph examiner. The investigator got up and led Michael to a chair at a wooden table, and once Michael was seated, the polygraph examiner approached him and ran a Velcro strap across Michael's chest and then another one across his stomach. These were steps in setting up the polygraph test. And as he was getting set up, Michael continued to sweat profusely, but smiled politely at the examiner. Then the examiner wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Michael's right upper arm and connected 2 small metal finger plates to his index and ring fingers on his left hand. The examiner explained that all of these tools were used to monitor Michael's blood pressure, breathing, and sweat gland activity. Michael gave out a little laugh when the examiner brought up the sweat gland activity because Michael at this point was basically drenched in sweat. The examiner went to a separate table to monitor the test results on his computer, and then at this point, the investigator sat down across from Michael. The investigator smiled and then, in a friendly voice, reminded Michael to just answer the questions truthfully to the best of his knowledge. They checked to make sure the polygraph machine was working, and then the investigator launched into a series of questions about the night Tracey was attacked. He asked Michael about his relationship with his wife, his relationship with the dead man Dustin, and about his work and financial situation. The investigator's voice remained calm and steady throughout the questioning, but Michael struggled with some of the questions about the night of the attack, like he couldn't think straight. And as the test went on, Michael began acting more and more uncomfortable, and the sweat kept pouring down his face. Finally, the investigator smiled again and thanked Michael for his help, and the examiner walked over to Michael and removed the straps, the blood pressure cuff, and the finger plates. Then they told Michael his test was over and he was free to go, and Brusher met him outside of the room and walked him back through the sheriff's station. And as they walked through the station, it was like all of the tension that had been building up during the polygraph suddenly spilled out. Michael, who now had an angry look on his face, said to Brusher that he couldn't believe the police were wasting their time on him, that he loved his wife, and they needed to find the second attacker before anything else happened. But after Michael had stormed out to his car, the polygraph examiner began going over the results of the test. And while the examiner knew that polygraph tests could not be considered 100% accurate, there still was a very strong indication from Michael's test that he had lied multiple times when responding to questions about the night of the attack. And so for now, police considered Michael their primary suspect for being the person behind getting Dustin to try to murder Tracey. The money Michael would receive from the life insurance policy if Tracey died was a clear motive. He had a good relationship with Dustin, and he knew enough about Tracey's custody battle to try to make it look like Tracey's ex-husband was the one behind everything. Later that day, Michael got home and he was furious that the investigation had turned its sights onto him. And Tracey was just as angry. She didn't believe Michael had anything to do with the attack, and she thought the police were desperate to make up for the fact that after 2 months, they still had no leads on this second attacker. And so she told Michael that she was afraid the second attacker could show up at the house anytime to try to kill her and finish the job Dustin had failed to do. But over the next few months, the police still had not made progress in finding the second person who'd gone into Tracey's house. And while Michael remained a suspect, they hadn't found any evidence that could prove he had hired Dustin to try to kill his wife. So as the police struggled to move the investigation forward, Tracey came up with a plan to try to force them to work harder and faster to find this second attacker. She decided to take her story to the public in the hope that that would put added pressure on investigators. So in October of 2002, 10 months after the attack, Tracey and Michael appeared on The Montel Williams Show, a popular daytime TV talk show that aired all across the country. On the show, Tracey told her story about the night Dustin and this other person had broken into her house and how she had fought them off and managed to kill Dustin in self-defense while her 11-year-old boy protected his little brother and sister. And then before the interview ended, Michael spoke, and he said one of the main reasons they came on the show was because the second attacker was still out there, and that attacker posed a big threat to their family and the entire community in early Iowa. And Michael urged anyone who had any information to come forward, and he pressed the authorities to keep working to find this second attacker and bring them to justice. After appearing on this show, there was a media frenzy in early Iowa. Newspapers and TV channels all wanted to talk to Tracey and their family and hear the story again for their listeners. And this is exactly what Tracey and her family had hoped for. But it didn't actually bring investigators any closer to finding the second attacker, because no one came forward with any more information. And so really, the constant media attention just started to tear both families at the center of this story apart, Tracey's family and Dustin's family. On Thanksgiving Day of 2002, almost a year after Dustin's death, his father walked through the cemetery where his son was buried. It was a cold and gray day, and Dustin's dad walked past bare trees and felt dead grass crunch beneath his feet. Then he passed a row of headstones and finally arrived at his son's grave. He sat down on the cold ground next to Dustin's headstone and he put one hand on it. Then he took a breath, reached into his pocket with the other hand, pulled out a revolver, pressed the barrel against his chest, and fired. Dustin's father died on his son's grave, and he left behind a note saying he had cried every day since his son's death. And not long after Dustin's father took his own life, people in town started to wonder if Tracey and Michael had pushed things too far by going on a national TV talk show and had driven Dustin's father to take his own life. And when the town of Early, Iowa started to turn against Tracey and Michael started fighting all the time. And the fighting got even worse in the summer of 2003 when it became clear that investigators had all but given up on finding the second attacker, and the case seemed like it was going to go cold. And so, not long after that, Michael and Tracey got divorced, and Tracey left Early, Iowa with her kids, hoping she could put everything that had happened behind her. With Tracey gone, Deputy Brusher knew the case was no longer a priority, and that even if it remained open, the case files would likely just sit in a drawer somewhere collecting dust. And for years, Brusher would be right. Fast forward to the end of 2008, 7 years after Dustin's death. Detective Trent Valletta of Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation was sitting at his desk looking at crime scene photos of Dustin Wade lying dead in Tracey's bedroom. Part of Valletta's job was to review cold cases. Cold cases are those that remain open but likely cannot move forward without the discovery of new evidence. And the cold case involving Dustin and Tracey, which hadn't progressed in years, occupied most of Valletta's time and energy. Because when he reviewed the files, there were several things he just could not shake. He didn't understand why there was absolutely no information about the supposed puppet master behind Dustin and this other phantom second attacker, or why Michael had seemingly been dropped as a suspect without any definitive proof that he really wasn't involved. And the more Valletta studied the crime scene photos, autopsy report, interviews, and the pink spiral notebook found in Dustin's car, the more he felt like evidence had been overlooked and that the case really needed to be closely re-examined. But Valletta knew he would need to have something far more concrete than just his feelings about the case to get the resources and manpower needed to remount a full investigation. And so, in early 2009, a couple of months after Valletta had begun looking back into this case, Valletta reached out to an Iowa State Police detective who he trusted. The guy was a former Navy SEAL, an expert marksman, and was known for catching things at crime scenes that others might miss. And when this detective dug into the case files to help Valletta, something jumped out to him right away. And what he saw would give Valletta enough new information to convince his bosses to fully reopen and reinvestigate this case. And once they did that, Valletta was able to find the so-called puppet master who had planned everything on the night that Dustin Wade showed up at Tracey Roberts' house. Based on new information discovered after Valletta and the other detectives started reviewing the case, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe actually happened on the night Dustin Wade died, December 13th, 2001. On the evening of December 13th, Dustin pulled his white sedan into the driveway of a home in a suburban neighborhood. He stepped out of the car, walked up to the front door, and knocked. A moment later, he heard the sound of the puppet master calling for him to come inside. And so Dustin opened the door, stepped inside, and he was immediately greeted by the puppet master who was smiling at him. Before Dustin could say anything, the puppet master asked Dustin if he wouldn't mind writing a few things down for them. Dustin said no problem, and he followed the puppet master into the kitchen and sat down at the table. And as soon as he was seated, the puppet master handed him a pink notebook along with a pen and told him to write down everything they said. And so Dustin just did as he was told. He wrote down everything the puppet master said. And when Dustin was finished, he asked the puppet master if there was any other work they needed from him. And the puppet master said yes, actually there was something they wanted to show him that was in the upstairs bedroom. And so the puppet master got up and told Dustin to follow them, and Dustin did just that. Once they got upstairs, the puppet master led Dustin into a bedroom, and while Dustin was standing near the door of the bedroom, the puppet master walked around the bed and crouched down out of Dustin's view for a second. and so Dustin just stood there waiting to see whatever it was the puppet master wanted to show him. Then suddenly, the puppet master stood up, turned around, and pointed 2 guns directly at Dustin. And before Dustin could figure out what was happening, the puppet master fired multiple shots at him. One of the bullets hit Dustin in the stomach and he began to stumble backwards, and then when he turned to run out into the hallway, the puppet master shot him again in the arm. Dustin cried out for help, but the puppet master kept on shooting and put another round into his back, which caused Dustin to fall to the ground onto his chest. At this point, Dustin was barely breathing and a huge pool of blood was forming all around his body. The puppet master, who by this point had stopped shooting, took a few steps forward and stood directly over Dustin. They aimed one of their guns at the back of his head and fired 4 more shots, killing Dustin. Then, the puppet master put the guns down, ran out of the bedroom, flew down the stairs, and rushed to the kitchen. They picked up the pink spiral notebook they had given Dustin to write in and ran to the front of the house. They threw the front door open, stepped out into the cold winter air, and walked over to the driveway where Dustin's car was parked. They opened the unlocked driver's side door, reached across, and placed the pink notebook on the seat. Then the puppet master calmly walked back inside, headed upstairs to the bedroom, and yelled for their children to get help. It would turn out there had never been a home invasion or an attack on Tracey Roberts by Dustin and some unknown second attacker. In truth, the puppet master was Tracey, and she had killed Dustin in cold blood, and almost everything she had told the police was a lie. Tracey had set up the entire thing. She knew Dustin would be easy to manipulate, and so on the promise of giving him some extra work for some money he could use to buy more video games, she had lured Dustin to her house and then tricked him into writing a fake confession in that pink notebook. Then she murdered Dustin and then wrapped pantyhose around her own neck to give herself an injury, and then she tried to frame her ex-husband for hiring Dustin to kill her so she could win the custody battle for her son. And it was the former Navy SEAL who had pointed out to Valletta that the crime scene photos didn't match with Tracey's story. She said she had been attacked in the dark and was wildly firing her gun behind her, and then also shooting at a shadow of her attacker as he tried to get up off the floor. The former Navy SEAL said that it would have been impossible for someone even with his level of expertise in firearms to create the gunshot pattern found on Dustin's body while struggling and firing blind. And he told Valletta he was certain that the multiple shots to the back of Dustin's head had been made with the light on and with the shooter standing directly over Dustin with a clear view of their target. And once Valletta had that information, he was able to convince his bosses to let him reinvestigate the case. And it turned out that when he tracked Tracey Roberts down, she was living under a new name in Ohio, she was using a British passport she'd obtained with forged documents, and she was presenting herself to some people as a London socialite, and even using a fake British accent. Once Valletta met with Tracey, her story about the home invasion unraveled quickly. Valletta discovered discrepancies in different interviews she'd given to the police, to the newspapers, and on the Montel Williams show. And eventually, her second ex-husband, Michael, admitted that he had never fully believed Tracey's version of events, and that was probably why it seemed like he was lying during his polygraph test. And with Michael and others who had been close to Tracey now helping police, they were able to get enough evidence to finally arrest Tracey for Dustin's murder. Tracey would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. On a night in late September of 1994, 18-year-old Aaron Itura sat at the very front of a packed meeting room in a community center in Eugene, Oregon, staring out at the crowd of mostly teenagers. The fold-out metal chair Aaron was sitting on was too small for his 6'5", 230-pound frame, so he shifted back and forth to try to get comfortable. Some of the kids sitting out in the audience looked excited to be there, and others looked nervous. But the only people in the crowd that really stood out to Aaron were the young men sitting in a cluster right off to the side of the room. They leaned forward in their chairs, showed off their blue bandanas wrapped around their wrists, and glared at Aaron like they wanted to challenge him to a fight. Over the last year, Aaron had become an important member of an anti-gang task force in Eugene that was led by a woman named Mary Thompson, who was sitting right next to him. And Aaron spent a lot of his free time going with Mary to community centers and high schools in the area to talk about the dangers of gang life, just like he was going to do tonight. The crowds that Aaron and Mary spoke to at these events usually included kids and teenagers who had thought about joining a gang but wanted something better out of life. They also included former gang members who were trying to turn their lives around, and current gang members who had been forced to attend by the state as part of their punishment for a crime they'd committed. But tonight, Aaron knew the cluster of young men glaring at him from the audience didn't fit into any of those groups. These were current gang members who were here by choice. They just wanted to intimidate Mary, Aaron, and the others who had come to speak out against gang life. And he knew, because of their blue bandanas, that they were members of Eugene's most powerful gang, the 74 Hoover Crips. And as far as they were concerned, Aaron was clearly their enemy. In school, Aaron saw members of the 74 Hoover Crips bully kids who they believed were weak and would fight anyone they didn't like, and he saw how the gang spread violence and fear throughout Eugene. At the convenience store where Aaron worked, he'd witnessed knife fights and robberies carried out by gang members, and he knew the gang was tied to much bigger crimes in the city like carjackings, assaults, and drug trafficking. Eugene was a relatively small college town known for its natural beauty, with the Cascade Mountains in the east and the Willamette River winding through the city. But the 74 Hoover Crips had created something ugly amidst those beautiful surroundings, and Aaron wanted to help stop the spread of gang-related crime and violence before it completely overran his beloved hometown. The crowd quieted down as Mary Thompson stood up, stepped forward, and introduced herself. Aaron had seen Mary speak dozens of times, but he was still blown away by how well she commanded a room. That night, she talked about the problems gangs posed in the city and how it was up to people like her and everyone in the audience to turn away from gangs and become a positive force in their community. And most of the audience hung on her every word. But Mary said this meeting was not about her. She believed that teenagers wanted to hear from other teenagers way more than they wanted to hear from a woman who was almost 40 like her. So she thanked everyone for coming and then introduced Aaron. Aaron stood up from his chair, he smiled at Mary, and then took a few steps towards the audience. Even the toughest members of the 74 Hoover Crips in the crowd were taken aback by Aaron's huge size. But Aaron almost always had a smile on his face, and his voice was warm and soft, which was why he was known around school as the, quote, gentle giant. Aaron used his time in front of the group that night to talk about the future. He knew a lot of people in the crowd had made mistakes in the past, but that didn't mean they still couldn't achieve great things. He talked about how gangs could destroy young people's lives and how it was so important to find something positive to be passionate about. Aaron explained that his own passion was art. He said he loved to draw, and he worked hard to keep getting better at it, and he said his passion for drawing had led him to apply to art school in New York City, and now when he graduated from high school, he was going to pursue something he loved and have an adventure on the other side of the country. At the end of Aaron's talk, members of the audience applauded, and Mary beamed as she looked out at the crowd. But as Aaron took his seat, he noticed the cluster of young men with their blue bandanas on their wrists were not clapping. They were still just glaring at him. And when Mary stood up and wrapped up the meeting and said goodnight and told everyone to head out, those young men made sure to wait back and then stare back angrily at Aaron as they were the last to leave the room. Aaron tried not to let their stares bother him, but he couldn't help but feel a little rattled. Clearly, their intimidation technique had worked. But after the audience had left, Mary came over to him and gave him a big hug and said he did a great job, and suddenly Aaron felt a lot better. In the time that he had known Mary, he'd come to see her almost like a second mother. Aaron had a great relationship with his own mother, but he felt like Mary pushed him to be the best version of himself, and he was amazed that someone who had experienced as much heartache as Mary had could still be so positive and give so much of her time to helping others. Mary had become an anti-gang activist because she had personally seen what gangs in Eugene could do to young people and how they could tear families apart. Years earlier, Mary's son, Beau Flynn, had actually been one of the founders of Eugene's infamous 74 Hoover Crips when he was just 13 years old. and under Beau's leadership, the gang had grown, had acquired a sizable stash of guns, and had progressed from small-time robberies to more violent crimes with bigger payoffs. Mary had always been a very protective mother and would do anything for Beau, but she knew she was losing her son to this gang. And so when Beau's gang lifestyle began catching up to him, and he started going in and out of juvenile detention centers, Mary decided to form an anti-gang group to try to prevent other parents from having to experience what she was currently experiencing with her son. Over the past couple of years, Mary's anti-gang group had grown, and she'd quickly become one of the most well-known anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. Through meetings, seminars, and TV appearances, Mary's message reached thousands of people in the region. And for a time, Mary's anti-gang messaging was not just helping the community, it also appeared to be having an impact at home on her son. For the past year, Mary's son, Beau, who was now 16, had been home from his latest stint in a juvenile detention center, and at first when he got home, it seemed like he was ready to just walk away from gang life, that he understood it was not good for him. And Mary thought that it was not just her own influence that had caused this change in her son, but also it was Aaron's voice that her son had listened to and was now responding to. Aaron had liked Mary's son, Beau, from the moment he met him. And Aaron, who was the oldest of 5 children, treated Beau like another younger sibling who needed to be looked after and protected. The 2 young men spent lots of time together at Mary's house after school, they hung out on the weekends, and Aaron always did his best to keep Beau out of trouble. And as the boys spent more time together, Mary hoped that Beau would start to think about his future, just like Aaron did. But Beau was not Aaron. And eventually, Beau was just not able to resist the allure of getting back into his gang life. And in mid-September, just weeks before Mary and Aaron's anti-gang meeting with the intimidating young men with bandanas staring at Aaron, Beau had gotten into a knife fight with a rival gang member, and he'd ended up back in a juvenile detention center. Mary was obviously heartbroken, and she now worried that Beau might never get to come home again. In the weeks following the knife attack by Beau and the anti-gang meeting that Aaron and Mary had run, Aaron continued to work with Mary to organize other events for the anti-gang group, but he also thought it was important to focus on the things he personally really loved in his life, like his artwork, his family, and his girlfriend. Aaron had been dating 22-year-old Carrie Barkley for a little over 4 months, and both of them were convinced the other was the love of their life. Their relationship had gotten serious very quickly, and so Carrie regularly spent the night at Aaron's house. In fact, she was there so often that Aaron's mother had begun to view Carrie less as Aaron's girlfriend and more as her daughter-in-law. At 10 p.m. on Sunday, October 2nd, so a few weeks after Beau's knife attack and Aaron and Mary's anti-gang meeting, Aaron and Carrie were relaxing on the couch inside of Aaron's home, watching TV and talking. Aaron sat with his arm wrapped around Carrie's shoulders, and Carrie, who was already dressed for bed in a white t-shirt and pajama pants, was curled up tightly right next to him. And as they sat there enjoying the night, the landline phone in Aaron's house suddenly started ringing. And immediately, Aaron leapt up off the couch and rushed to go answer it, but before he could, he heard the oldest of his sisters pick up the phone in her bedroom. So Aaron turned around and sat back down on the couch next to Carrie and put his arm back around her and kept watching TV. But almost as soon as he'd sat down, his sister, who had just answered the phone, walked into the living room. She said the person on the phone had asked for Aaron, but when she told the caller she'd go get him, the caller had hung up. Aaron told his sister not to worry about it, but when she left the room, a look of concern came across Aaron's face. He didn't know why someone would call him so late on a Sunday night just to hang up. But when Carrie, who could now see the look of concern on Aaron's face, asked Aaron what was wrong, he said, "Oh, everything's fine. Whoever called must have just realized they didn't actually need to talk to me, and so that's why they hung up." Carrie shrugged, and then the two of them settled back down on the couch and watched TV and talked for a few more hours. Then finally, at around midnight, Carrie said she was tired, so they decided to go to bed. After turning off the TV, Aaron and Carrie got up and walked across the first floor of the house to the door that led into the garage. Aaron had built a makeshift bedroom inside of the garage. It was like a little cubicle in the corner with a sheetrock wall and a wooden door for privacy. And so Aaron and Carrie walked into the garage and made their way over to Aaron's bedroom door. They opened it up and stepped inside. The room was very small, with 2 mattresses piled up on the floor, and on the walls were posters of some of Aaron's favorite bands and movies, along with some of his own drawings and a few beer ads featuring scantily clad women. There were also empty pizza boxes and fast food bags on the floor because Aaron and Carrie often ate in this room by themselves, and neither of them really liked to clean up. Carrie climbed onto the mattresses, slid over to her side of the bed furthest from the door, and got under the covers. Then Aaron took off his shirt and jeans, got into bed next to her, gave her a kiss, and then soon after that, they both drifted off to sleep. About an hour later, at around 1:30 a.m., Aaron's mother, who was asleep in her first-floor bedroom, woke up suddenly to the sound of screaming. As she sat up in bed, she thought the sounds were coming from the TV in the living room, that maybe Aaron and Carrie had left it on. But when she stepped out into the hallway, she could tell right away the screaming was not coming from the TV. It was coming from a real person, likely inside of the garage. Aaron's mom sprinted down the hallway through the living room to the door that led into the garage, and then once she was in the garage, she could tell the screaming was coming from Carrie, who was still inside of Aaron's actual little bedroom. So Aaron's mother rushed over to the door, she flung it open, and when she saw what was inside, she began screaming too. And then eventually she turned around and ran back into the house and dialed 911. A couple hours later, at almost 4 a.m., Detective Jim Michaud of the Violent Crime Squad of the Eugene Department of Public Safety drove his 1993 Ford Taurus down a quiet, tree-lined street towards Aaron's house. When Detective Michaud pulled up to the modest 2-story split-level house with a 2-car garage in front, he saw red and blue flashing lights from the police cruisers parked outside and yellow crime scene tape strung across the front of the house. Michaud thought a scene like this seemed so out of place in such a quiet and safe neighborhood. After parking, Michaud stepped out of his car and breathed in the crisp morning fall air. He was a veteran in law enforcement and an experienced lead detective, but there was something about receiving calls in the dead of night that still put him on edge. But at least he knew what he was about to walk into. He'd been informed that an 18-year-old male named Aaron Itura had been found shot in his bedroom and that he had been rushed to the hospital. Michaud had also been told that there was no sign of forced entry and that the victim's girlfriend had been found in bed with him, but completely unharmed. And Michaud knew that in a situation like this, the girlfriend was usually the most obvious suspect. So Michaud walked up to the house, where he was greeted by the officers who were already on the scene. Those officers led him inside the house, where he saw Carrie sitting on the living room couch with Aaron's mother and his oldest sister. All 3 women were still in the clothes they'd been sleeping in, and they were crying and holding each other. But before Michaud could talk to them, he needed to see the crime scene. So he walked past the women and followed the officers out to the garage and into Aaron's makeshift bedroom. And when he stepped into that bedroom, he saw a pool of blood on one of the pillows, as well as blood spatter on the walls. After Michaud had studied the room for a few moments, he turned and headed back into the main house. And when he did, crime scene techs filtered back into the garage bedroom to take more photos and take more blood samples. Once Michaud was back in the living room and began approaching the 3 crying women on the couch, one of them, Aaron's mom, lifted her head up, and seeing Michaud walking toward her, she started begging him if she could be allowed to leave and go to the hospital to be with her son. It had been hours since the ambulance had taken him, and she couldn't stand the thought of Aaron lying in a hospital bed alone with nobody who loved him nearby. In a gentle voice, Michaud said he would make sure she got to the hospital as soon as possible, but he needed to do a couple of things before he could let her go. He told Aaron's mom that he was the lead detective on this case and that he had a few questions for all of them. He also said that he would need to run gunpowder residue tests on her, her daughter, and Carrie. A residue test indicates whether or not someone has recently fired a gun. Michaud assured Aaron's mother that this test was standard protocol for shootings, and she said that she understood. As an officer swabbed the women's hands as part of that gunpowder residue test, Michaud took a seat in front of the couch. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he asked them if they had seen or heard anything unusual in the house the previous night. Carrie sat forward and looked around to see if anybody else was going to speak, and then she cleared her throat and began talking. And as she did, Michaud watched her closely, because as of right now, she was his primary suspect. As Carrie spoke with a shaky voice, she made it clear that she had been asleep in bed with Aaron when she heard this loud noise, and she said when she woke up because of this noise, she saw two men with blue bandanas over their faces rushing out of their little bedroom, and then she turned and saw Aaron was bleeding on the bed next to her. Michaud had worked enough violent crime investigations in the area to know that men in blue bandanas almost always meant the same thing: the 74 Hoover Crips. So Michaud asked the women if Aaron had any connections to that gang. And at this, Aaron's mother told him that Aaron was heavily involved in Mary Thompson's anti-gang task force. The idea of gang members carrying out a hit on an anti-gang activist made a lot of sense to Michaud, but there were still a few things about the crime scene that stood out to him. There was no sign of forced entry into the house, and Carrie was left completely unharmed. And in all the gang-style hits that Michaud knew about, the shooters almost always made sure no witnesses were left behind, meaning they killed everyone. Michaud thanked the three women for their information and told Aaron's mother and sister that someone from victim services would arrive soon to escort them and the rest of their family to the hospital. Then Michaud turned to Carrie and said that she would actually need to come with him to the station. He explained that because she was literally in the room with Aaron when he was shot, she likely had more information that could really help the police. In reality, Michaud figured that either Carrie was lying about seeing those two men in bandanas, or she was telling the truth and he had yet another case of gang violence on his hands. Either way, he needed to question Carrie further. When Michaud and Carrie arrived at the police station, Michaud led her into a small bright room, and then he sat down opposite her across a black wooden table. Carrie pulled a blanket she'd taken from Aaron's house tight across her shoulders, but Michaud could still see spots of blood all over her white t-shirt. And Michaud could also see that she was trembling under the blanket. Michaud began to ask Carrie about her and Aaron's relationship, if there were any problems between them, if they had fought recently. And Carrie would say no, they got along great, they were in love, they didn't fight, nothing. But when Michaud just continued to ask more and more questions about their relationship, Carrie picked up on the idea that she was being looked at as a suspect, and she finally just said, "Shouldn't you be out looking for the two men in bandanas that I saw? Why are we still talking about our relationship?" Michaud could sense Carrie's frustration and figured at this point he likely was not going to get very much more information out of her. And so Michaud shifted the conversation to something different and really specific. He said, "Okay, thank you so much for your help, but before you go, do you remember if you noticed anything missing from the bedroom? Did these two men wearing bandanas steal anything?" At first, Carrie said she couldn't think of anything, but then she remembered and she said, actually yes, a pack of cigarettes was missing from her purse. Michaud thought this was an odd thing for someone to steal during a shooting, but he didn't bring that up. Instead, he just thanked Carrie for her time and said someone would be there soon to take her home. Then he got up from the table, headed out of the room, and walked outside to his car. He held up his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun. He was tired, but he knew he still had a long way to go before he could rest. A few hours later, at around 10:30 a.m., Aaron's mother and Aaron's siblings were by Aaron's bedside at the hospital. As the machines that were keeping Aaron alive buzzed and beeped, Aaron's mother wiped the tears from her eyes and leaned in close to her son's ear. She whispered to him that she loved him and that he was the strongest person she ever knew, then she kissed him on his forehead. 15 minutes later, Aaron's brain activity ceased and he passed away. As doctors and nurses began coming into the room, Aaron's mother stepped back away from the bed and clung on to her other children who were crying in her arms. She had always said her family was like a wheel, and Aaron was the spoke that held it all together. Now he was gone, and she had no idea how she would keep living without him. A few hours after Aaron died, Detective Michaud parked his car outside of a house located only a few miles away from Aaron's house. Michaud had just learned that Aaron's mother, sister, and Carrie had all tested negative for gunpowder residue, which meant none of them had recently fired a gun, and therefore very likely were not involved in Aaron's murder. And so, after receiving these results, Michaud believed that Carrie must have been telling the truth about the two men in bandanas she'd seen in Aaron's bedroom. And so, Michaud thought that a gang-style hit now seemed like the strongest possibility for what happened. So now, he wanted to talk to the person who knew more about Aaron's anti-gang activities than anyone else, Mary Thompson, Aaron's mentor and leader of the anti-gang task force. Michaud got out of his car and walked up to Mary's front door and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open, and Mary quickly ushered Michaud inside to the kitchen, where they both sat down. Mary said she could not believe what happened to Aaron. He had been such a positive influence on young people in Eugene, and he'd been such a vital part of her anti-gang work. And with her son Beau already locked away, she told Michaud losing Aaron felt like she'd lost another son. Michaud felt bad for Mary, but he knew he had to ask her some pretty difficult questions, so instead of trying to make small talk, he just looked her in the eyes and said, "Mary, do you think Beau had anything to do with Aaron's death?" Remember, her son Beau was a founding member of the 74 Hoover Crips, which Michaud believes were involved in Aaron's death. Mary immediately shook off the idea that Beau could have had anything to do with Aaron's murder, but after she said this, she stood up and began pacing around the room. Michaud noticed her somewhat anxious behavior and asked her, how can you be so sure Beau was innocent? And Mary would say, well, for one, Beau and Aaron were really close, and two, Beau is in a juvenile detention center and has been for weeks and was when Aaron was killed, so he couldn't have done this. Michaud nodded like he agreed with her, but in truth, Michaud knew that it was entirely possible for crimes to be committed or at least masterminded from behind bars, especially when gangs were involved. And Michaud also knew mothers would often say anything to protect their sons, even if their son was clearly a gang member and she was clearly an anti-gang activist. So Michaud ultimately thanked Mary for her time and information and just asked her to please let police know if she thought of anything that might help with their investigation, and she said she would. Over the next few days, Michaud tried to question known members of the 74 Hoover Crips, but none of them were willing to talk to him because he was police. But on October 6th, so 3 days after Aaron's murder, Mary reached out to Michaud and gave him a huge tip. Mary's anti-gang work put her in contact with a lot of young people who were trying to get out of the gang life. But some of them still had connections to the 74 Hoover Crips, and she called police to tell them that some of those kids she worked with said they knew who had killed Aaron because the killers were bragging about it at school. Jim Elstad and Joe Brown were two teenage boys who had gone to school with Aaron and one of his sisters for years. At one time, they had all been friends, but recently, Jim and Joe had gotten heavily involved with the 74 Hoover Crips, and now they were being overheard bragging that they had shown their worth to the gang by killing one of the loudest anti-gang activists in Oregon, Aaron. Police tracked Jim and Joe down at their houses and brought them in for questioning. Michaud met with them in a small room similar to the one where he'd questioned Carrie. The fluorescent lights were bright and buzzing overhead. Michaud sat down across from them at a table and just stared at them for a minute. They were both average height or shorter, and neither of them looked like they weighed more than 150 pounds. As he stared at them, he was sure they never would have had the guts to try to take on the 6'5", 230-pound Aaron if they didn't have a gun with them. Michaud eventually leaned back in his chair and then calmly said that he had heard they had been bragging at school about being the ones who'd killed the big guy. And Jim and Joe just grinned and said, yes, they were the ones who'd murdered Aaron. Michaud stared at them in shock. He'd just spent days dealing with other gang members who wouldn't say a word to him, and now these two boys weren't trying to hide their gang affiliations or their crime at all. What was going on? And so Michaud sat forward and asked them, okay, well, why'd you do it? And they said Aaron and his anti-gang activities were one of the main reasons police were paying so much attention to their gang, and they figured if they could take Aaron down, they could help bring down the entire anti-gang task force. Michaud could not believe how forthcoming they were being, so he just continued asking questions. He asked the boys to explain exactly how they killed Aaron, and again, without any hesitation, Jim and Joe told him. And the story they told matched up with the evidence police found in Aaron's bedroom, and it matched up with Carrie's story of what she saw on the night of the murder. Jim and Joe also told Michaud that after they shot Aaron and rushed out of his garage, they drove to the river and threw the gun in the water. And when they said this, Michaud remembered that earlier that day, a fisherman had turned in a gun he had retrieved in the water, and while police were still running tests on this gun to figure out if it was the murder weapon in Aaron's case, Michaud now understood that very likely it was. It was Jim and Joe's gun. After Jim and Joe told Michaud everything, Michaud arrested them for Aaron's murder. But while the rest of the police department began congratulating Michaud on getting the case solved so quickly, Michaud couldn't help but feel like something was off. This was too easy. Jim and Joe had said they killed Aaron to reduce attention on the 74 Hoover Crips, but killing a well-known anti-gang activist who was beloved in the community seemed like a surefire way to do the opposite of that. So why in the world would the 74 Hoover Crips do something like this? Who would sign off on this? It all just seemed totally backwards. And it would turn out Michaud was right in thinking that this case was not quite solved yet, because Aaron's mother would receive a very strange phone call not long after Joe and Jim were arrested, and when she told Michaud about this strange phone call, it would send Michaud down a path he never expected to go down. Based on that strange phone call Aaron's mother received, and evidence gathered and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Aaron Itorra in the very early hours of October 3rd, 1994. At 10 p.m. on October 2nd, a teenage girl sat in her bedroom. She stared at the swirling smoke and smelled the marijuana burning from the joint she held in her hand. With her other hand, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number. On the other end, she heard Aaron's sister answer. The girl asked the sister if Aaron was home, and as soon as Aaron's sister had said yes and that she'd go and get him, the caller hung up the phone. That was all the info she needed. The girl took another long, slow drag on the joint to calm her nerves, then she picked up the phone again and dialed another number. It was the number to the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. When the gang leader answered, the girl took a deep breath, then she said Aaron was home. The gang leader told the girl she'd done a good job and then hung up. After that, the gang leader called a young man and told him that everything was in place and that tonight was the night. Hours later, at around 1 a.m. on October 3rd, two young men dressed in black with blue bandanas covering their faces walked down the street towards Aaron's house. The streetlights were bright, so they moved fast and tried to stay in the shadows. One of them clutched a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in his hand. When they reached Aaron's house, they stopped on the street out in front of it and just stared. All of the lights inside were off, and so the two young men hoped that this meant everyone inside was asleep. As they stared at the garage door that they knew led to Aaron's room, they both wondered if maybe they were going too far. But they knew if they didn't go through with this, they would be in trouble with the leader of their gang, and that was the last thing either of them wanted. So they eventually just nodded to each other and then walked up to the garage door. The garage door was not locked, so they crouched down and just slowly raised it up, trying to make as little noise as possible. And once they were inside the garage, they walked over to the corner where Aaron's makeshift bedroom was. They opened the door, and right away they could see Aaron and Carrie sleeping in the bed. The young man who had the gun in his hand stayed by the door, getting the courage up to fire the gun, while the other young man crept forward and grabbed Carrie's purse, which was lying on the ground next to the bed. And after looking through it, he found a pack of cigarettes, pulled them out, and held them up to his partner standing by the door with the gun, like he was holding up his prize, and then after tucking the cigarettes into his pocket, he made his way back to the door. And at this point, the young man with the gun finally had the courage up, and he stepped forward till he was right next to the bed, and he held the gun out and looked straight down at Aaron. Aaron was sleeping on his side, with his face looking away from the gunman at Carrie. Then the gunman took several short breaths, made sure he was aiming his revolver point blank at the back of Aaron's head, and then he fired. As the two young men turned and ran out of the bedroom, Carrie was already sitting up and screaming. So the two men just continued running out of the garage, out onto the street, down the road to their car. They hopped inside, they fired it on, peeled out, and sped off down the street. When the two young men got out of Aaron's neighborhood, they started laughing and shouting with excitement. Then they pulled down their blue bandanas, and both of them let out a huge sigh of relief. Jim and Joe were these two young men. They really had murdered Aaron just like they had confessed to. But they had left out a crucial detail to their confession, which was who told them to kill Aaron. Not long after speeding away from Aaron's house, Jim and Joe arrived outside of a new location, another house. Once they scanned behind them to make sure no one had followed them, they hopped out of the car and made their way up to the front door of this house and knocked. Within seconds, the door had swung open, and standing in front of them was the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. She looked at them with a neutral expression, then scanned behind them to make sure they were alone, and then she told them to come inside. It would turn out the real leader of the 74 Hoover Crips was not Bo. It was his mother, Mary Thompson, one of the leading anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. She used her position as a mentor in the community not to try to scare young people away from gang life, but instead to actively recruit them for her gang. And for a long time, this setup had worked out great, until recently when her son, who really was a founder of the 74 Hoover Crips, Bo, got arrested for attacking a man with a knife. And while there were lots of witnesses to this attack, only one person was prepared to actually testify in court. And that person was Aaron, because Aaron was actually an anti-gang activist, even if it was awkward that he was testifying against Bo, the son of the person he worked with. And as Bo's trial approached, Mary decided Aaron just needed to be silenced, so she ordered his execution. When Jim and Joe confessed to killing Aaron, they never gave Mary away. They took the fall completely for the killing. But for reasons no one understands, 3 days after the murder, Mary herself decided to call Aaron's mother. And on this phone call, she says to Aaron's mother, if Aaron had just kept his mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Aaron's mother was floored by this statement, and so she immediately called Michaud, who also thought Mary's comment was totally out of place, and soon after, he arranged for a wiretap of Mary's phones, and quickly the full extent of her involvement in citywide gang activity and the role she played in Aaron's murder became clear. Mary was ultimately found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison. But due to a legal technicality, her sentence was reduced and she was released after serving only 23 years. Before his death, Aaron had become an organ donor, and after his death, 5 people received his organs and their lives were saved because of Aaron.
In October of 2007, Helena Carroll and her fiancé John Cullen had saved a little bit of money and they were torn on what to do with it. They knew they should put it aside and put it towards a down payment on a new house, but they also really wanted to go on vacation, and lately life had been very stressful for both of them, and so ultimately they decided, let's just blow it all on an amazing vacation. And so later that month, they flew off to Thailand. Over the course of their week, they spent most of their time at their resort, sitting in the pool and eating nice food, and they were having this really nice time, and on their last day, they decided they needed to do something a little bit more adventurous. And so they decided to explore the Nam Talu cave inside of the Khao Sok National Park, which is this 160 million year old rainforest that was not that close to their resort. In fact, it was not really a huge tourist destination because of how cumbersome it was to get there. But from everything they read about this park and specifically this cave they wanted to go in, it was just this breathtaking experience, and so they were sold. After signing up for a guided tour, they headed down to the pier where they boarded a boat and drove 90 minutes to the entrance of this park. When they got off, they met their 2 guides and then walked down to this entrance area where they connected with the other 5 tourists that were going to be on this tour with them. Those 5 people were 2 Swiss parents and their 2 teenage daughters, along with a 10-year-old German boy who was there on his own. After everyone had said hello and introduced themselves, they began walking through the park towards this cave. The allure of the Nam Talu cave, which is the cave they were going to be going to, was there was a river that ran through it where at times as you walked through this cave, you'd have to hold onto a rope and wade through the water where the water was up to your waist or even up to your neck at times. But it felt safe and controlled, and it was kind of exhilarating for foreign tourists to go through the cave. As they were just about to get to the entrance of the Nam Talu cave, some park rangers happened to walk down the path next to them, and they exchanged some words with the 2 local guides that were leading this tour, and they told them it's a bad idea to go into the Nam Talu cave because this is the monsoon season. No one's supposed to be in there, and if it starts raining while you're inside the cave, you won't hear it, and it will flood the cave, and then you'll be trapped. But despite the warning, the group continued on because it hadn't rained that day, and there wasn't any rain in the forecast, and the 2 local guides that were leading this tour were really confident that they were not in danger. They entered the cave a little after 1 p.m., and right away they were walking through little puddles of water that got a little bit deeper, and pretty soon they were holding onto the rope and walking through the deeper sections of the cave. Water's up to their waist, and by all accounts, it was very exciting. And the entirety of the tour should only take about an hour, where it's 30 minutes in, you hit the turnaround point, and you come back. And they had made it about 20 to 25 minutes in, right before the turnaround point, when Helena and John, who were towards the front of the tour group, heard what sounded like a rushing or roaring sound coming from the entrance of the cave. And they turned around and they saw this wave of water barreling into the cave. And instinctively, John and Helena start climbing up the walls. And luckily, there was a ledge where they were, and they managed to scramble up onto this ledge. And Helena would say, as soon as she got up there, she turned around to look where she had just been standing, right as this surge of water blasted past them, carrying with it the 2 tour guides and the 10-year-old German boy who immediately got swept around the corner down the dark tunnel. And then seconds later, the 2 Swiss parents and their teenage daughters, they got swept away around the corner. The couple was now stranded on this ledge with no time to be upset about what they're witnessing because the water was not only surging past them, it was rising, and there was limited amount of space before they would just be completely submerged in water. And so they tried their best to climb up this wall to a slightly higher ledge, which was still only a few feet away from these rushing rapids. And so as they're crouched up on this ledge, John eventually says to Helena, we're going to die if we stay here. We're going to drown. And so I need to find a way to maybe get past this initial rush of water, and maybe on the far side of the cave, I can work my way back up to the entrance and hopefully get us some help. And initially Helena said, don't do it, don't leave, we're safe here. But eventually he said to her, I have to go. I love you, I have to go. And she said, okay, and he jumped into the water, and almost immediately he was pulled under and disappeared. For the next 20 hours, Helena had to sit on this ledge in total darkness until the water finally began to subside a little bit and rescuers could come in to get her. What had happened was after Helena and the rest of the tour group had gone inside of the cave, they made it just far enough in that they were out of earshot of what was happening outside of the cave. Right at that moment, a huge freak storm rolled in. There was this flash flood that was so intense, the lake that was right outside of the entrance to this cave, it rose up and began dumping directly into the cave. It was like a dam basically breaking, and all the water just poured in all at once. When Helena was finally let out of the cave, she didn't know what happened to her fiancé or the other tourists that were part of the group. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw there were 8 coffins that had been lined up right outside, and she found out that she was the sole survivor. Despite this tragedy, people still go into the Nam Talu cave even during monsoon season.
Our next story is called Stowaway.
In 1970, 14-year-old Keith Sapsford was living in Sydney, Australia with his parents, and he was desperate to travel the world. His parents wanted him to be able to travel, they just lacked the resources to be able to afford that kind of thing. However, they were able to pull a little bit of cash, and the 3 of them did go on a nice European vacation that his parents were hoping would kind of calm down his desires to want to travel all the time. They thought this would be, a taste before he got older and he could go travel as much as he wanted. But when he came back from that vacation, it really had the opposite effect. It was like Keith had experienced the life that he so desperately wanted, and now he's home, and it's like that life has been taken from him. Following that vacation, Keith began trying to run away from home. Not because he didn't want to be around his parents, but just because he saw it as his only way to, see the world. But every time he would run away, his parents would quickly find him and bring him back home. Their concern for their son would only grow, though, because he would find ways to sneak away and be gone for longer and longer stretches of time, and they're thinking it's only a matter of time before he really gets hurt. In an effort to save their son, they ended up enrolling him in this very strict boarding school that was for boys with behavioral problems, and they were hoping that the staff at the school was going to be able to kind of calm their son down and keep him from trying to run away all the time. But unfortunately, the school really had the opposite effect, because the school, in a sense, was like a prison. You weren't allowed to leave. And so immediately, Keith, when he gets there, he's looking for ways to escape this boarding school. And 2 weeks after arriving, he would be successful. He would elude the staff and he would escape. 3 days after he had escaped this boarding school, he found his way to the Sydney airport. Now, this is the 1970s, and it was far easier to get into an airport than it would be today, where there's lots of security. There wasn't much of that at the time that Keith was at the airport. And so Keith walked across the tarmac to a plane that was bound for Tokyo, and he climbed inside the wheel well. He tucked himself in there, and he waited for takeoff. A photographer named John Gilpin happened to be at the Sydney airport on the same day that Keith is now snuck into that wheel well, and he had a new lens for his camera that he was testing out. And at one point, he was just taking pictures of the tarmac, and he began taking pictures of a plane that was taking off, and it was the same plane that Keith had snuck into. And he takes pictures of it as it takes off, it goes up to altitude, and it flies away. And he just took a series of pictures of it, puts his camera away, doesn't think twice about it. John had inadvertently captured the final moments of Keith as he fell nearly 200 feet to his death. As soon as the pilot took off, the wheels were retracted, opening up that wheel well for a brief second, and there was nothing for Keith to hold on to, and he slipped out. But even if he had not fallen out, he almost certainly would have died from freezing temperatures and lack of oxygen at altitude.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Path Less Traveled. On a spring morning in 1870, a gold prospector named Frank Lemon rode his horse along the shore of the North Saskatchewan River, which is a river that runs through Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada. Frank was at the back of a line of about a dozen men who had all been hired by a rich investor named Lafayette French. He had commissioned them to search the Canadian wilderness for potential gold mines. And if they found a gold mine, then French would bankroll a full-scale mining operation and pull out all the gold he could, and these men who found it would get a cut of the profits. When Frank had signed up for this job, he had thought it was a great opportunity. In fact, he thought it was such a big opportunity that he had convinced his best friend, whose nickname was Blackjack, to come along as well. But now, after weeks of searching the wilderness for these mines and not finding any, all Frank really wanted to do now was just go home. And so as this group of men continued their ride along the shore, Frank sort of zoned out and just kind of stared off into the forest all around him. And then at some point, as he was doing this, as he was looking off to his right, he noticed amongst the thick trees, there was this little trail, this dirt trail that kind of wound off into the distance. And for some reason, Frank was just immediately drawn to it. And so he pulled on his horse's reins and came to a stop and just stared at this strange trail. Frank thought about how for all this time they'd been out here searching for gold, they'd basically only looked in this river and found nothing. And so he thought to himself, maybe the gold is not in the river, but it's maybe out there in the woods. And maybe this trail that he was looking at might lead them to gold. And so Frank turned back around to tell the rest of the group about his big idea, to try to go down this trail here. But when he looked, he saw all the men in the group, except for his best friend Blackjack, had continued on without him. They basically hadn't even stopped when Frank had stopped. However, Frank really didn't care that the group had left him because he was totally over this trip and frankly didn't want to be with this group anyways. And so he just looked over at Blackjack and just kind of gestured towards this trail as if to say, "You want to go this way?" And Blackjack, who was also totally over this trip, just smiled and nodded like, "Yeah, let's go." And so the two men turned their horses and began heading down this thin dirt trail off into the woods. For several hours, Frank and Blackjack continued on this trail deeper and deeper into the forest. You get a picture of very thick trees all around, and it's just this little winding dirt trail on the ground. They had no idea where this trail was going, but there was just something so powerful about this trail. It was like calling them to go. But as they rode along, Frank kept getting this bad feeling. Like he kept hearing what sounded like voices and footsteps right behind them on the trail. But every time he turned, all he saw was Blackjack. There was nobody around them at all. They were deep in the forest. And after a while, Frank kept hearing these noises, and he asked Blackjack, like, hey, are you hearing that stuff too? And Blackjack said, yeah, I am. But he too would turn around and see nothing. They were all alone. And so eventually, the men convinced themselves that, what those sounds must be is the sound of their party, who's discovered they have, left the group and maybe they're out there looking for them. But Frank and Blackjack really had no intention of rejoining the group. They kind of didn't like the group. And so they said, you know what, let's just keep on going. Eventually, the path these two friends were on led them to a stream. And so they stopped, they got off their horses, they knelt down and they scooped their canteens into the water to get a drink. And as Frank did that, he looked into the crystal clear water and he saw nuggets of gold just sitting there in the stream. Frank couldn't believe it. I mean, he's out here looking for gold, but he was not expecting to find it right here in the middle of nowhere, despite, his instinct that maybe the gold was out here. And so he just froze and he's staring at this. He can't believe it. He grabs Blackjack, who hadn't seen it yet, and pulls him over. Blackjack looks, and the two men, they're like, oh my goodness, we've done it. But Frank said, look, before we celebrate, let's see what we're dealing with here. Let's go upstream here and try to find the source of this gold. And so the two men, they got up, they're super excited. They start walking along the side of the stream, looking in the water. And as they're moving upstream, they're seeing all this gold in the water. And it's getting more and more. And eventually they reach this rock ledge the water was pouring over down into the stream. And literally in the ledge are these massive veins of gold. They had found a gigantic gold mine that clearly nobody else had tapped before. I mean, this could be worth not just millions of dollars, but billions of dollars. And so at this point, the two friends began to celebrate. They were ecstatic. I mean, this is unbelievable. They're jumping around, they're hugging each other. And then at some point, they just kind of stopped and went silent because they realized they now had a big dilemma. So the whole reason Frank and Blackjack were out here in the Canadian wilderness was to look for gold, but they were looking for gold on behalf of the rich investor, Lafayette French, which meant they were contractually obligated to tell French if they found gold. And so here they are, they found this massive gold mine, and that's what they're supposed to do, again, based on their contract. But if they did that, French would get rich beyond his wildest dreams from this mine. And yeah, he'd cut them a check, a piece of the profits, but it would be like nothing compared to what French would get from this gold mine. Or, and this is where the dilemma comes in, Frank and Blackjack could hide the fact that they had found this mine, and then they alone could come out here anytime they wanted, take the gold, and become rich themselves. Now, granted, they would have to be kind of subtle about it, because if they started showing up with barrelfuls of gold, Lafayette French is going to find out about it and they're going to be in trouble. But, there was a way to do it where this mine could effectively be theirs and they could get rich. But obviously, there was a lot of risk involved in that second choice. And so Frank and Blackjack decided that, this is way too big of a decision for us to make just on the fly right now. So let's just stay here in the area. Let's camp out for the night and just sleep on this and come to a decision tomorrow. So the two men left the stream and headed over to this clearing that was right nearby and decided that's where they would pitch their camp for the night. Blackjack left to go gather firewood, and Frank began to pitch their tent. And as Frank did that, as he began setting up their tent, he began hearing whispers, kind of like the voices he was hearing as they were walking in on that trail, and they kept thinking it was maybe the group that was looking for them. He began hearing those voices again. It was kind of all around him in the trees, but every time he looked, there was no one there. Now, Frank convinced himself that maybe these whispers were actually Blackjack because he had gone off to get firewood and maybe it was him. But at one point when Frank heard these whispers, he looked in the direction of the whispers. There was no one there. And he realized Blackjack was at the same time on the opposite side of the clearing. It could not have been him. And so Frank couldn't help but feel really unsettled. It was like there was somebody or something here watching them or listening to them, but he just couldn't tell who or what it was. But Frank just told himself to shake it off, don't worry about that. Instead, just focus on getting the camp set up. A few hours later, Frank and Blackjack were sitting on a log in front of their campfire eating rations, talking about what they were going to do with the gold. At some point, Frank said what he was really thinking about this whole situation. He told Blackjack, "Look, I think we'd be so stupid to tell Lafayette French. Why should we take a small payday one time when we can basically have an endless supply of wealth for the rest of our lives?" But when Frank looked over at Blackjack to see what his reaction was to this pitch, he could see right away that Blackjack disagreed. Blackjack was kind of looking down, and he kind of turned to Frank and was like, "Look, it's morally wrong to lie here. I would rather be poor and honest than rich and morally bankrupt." And so what had started as a civil discussion from this point on really escalated and just became a full-blown yelling fight, with both men absolutely refusing to budge on their stance about what to do with this gold. And eventually, when the two men were standing up and just screaming in each other's faces, Blackjack finally just threw his hands up and said, "You know what? Enough." And he turned around and stormed over to the tent and disappeared inside. For a minute, Frank just stood there stewing by the fire, just completely furious that Blackjack didn't see it the way he saw it. But eventually, Frank kind of calmed down and thought, "You know what? I need to go to bed too. Obviously, we are not near a decision. We need to sleep on this." And so, even though Frank was still upset, he walked over to the tent too, didn't say a word to Blackjack. He just climbed inside, got into his sleeping bag, and tried to go to sleep. But after laying there for a while, when Frank had not fallen asleep, and his friend Blackjack had, he was snoring and passed out, Frank just could not help feeling enraged again at his friend. Like, how can you not see this opportunity here? Why in the world would you tell Lafayette French? That's so stupid. And so Frank just laid there restlessly, tossing and turning, listening to the sound of Blackjack snoring and getting so mad at him. And as he did, Frank went from, I need to convince Blackjack in the morning that we need to keep the gold for ourselves, to, I need to stop Blackjack from telling anyone. He is an obstacle. He's not a friend. He's a problem. And as he thought about this, these dark thought loops were going through his head. Frank just became consumed with rage. It was like he couldn't control what he was doing. And in that moment, Frank found himself getting up, walking out of the tent, and grabbing an axe. And before he could even think about it, he had walked back into the tent, raised the axe, and driven it into Blackjack's skull, killing him instantly. A few minutes later, Frank was outside sitting by the campfire looking at his bloody hands, wondering what just happened. How could he have just done what he did? That was his best friend. What had come over him? It was like Frank was a different person. He couldn't understand. But as Frank was sitting there grappling with what he had just done, a twig suddenly snapped over in the direction of the tent. And instantly Frank looked over, like, who's over there? What's going on? And as he looked in the direction of the tent, he began to hear this low, guttural moaning. It almost sounded like a dying animal. And he thought for a second, like, wait a minute, is Blackjack not actually dead? Is that him making that noise? But at the same time, Frank's thinking, that's not possible. I practically split Blackjack's head in half with that axe. He can't be making that sound. But before Frank could even begin to process what he was hearing, this sound, this moaning sound, got louder and it got closer to Frank, like it was moving in his direction, but there's nobody here. And so Frank is horrified, and then right as the sound is practically on top of him, he began hearing those whispers, those voices he had been hearing in the woods on the way out here. Except this time the voices were clear. They were talking to Frank, and they were saying, "You're going to be tortured for what you did to Blackjack." And then just as soon as these voices began, suddenly they stopped. The moaning stopped, and the entire forest just went deadly silent. And Frank is just stuck there staring in the tent, wondering what's happening. And then the silence was broken by this unbelievably loud, high-pitched, blood-curdling human scream coming from the tent. And it was at that point that Frank just got up and sprinted to his horse and began riding away from the gold, his friend's body, everything. He didn't care. He needed to get out of there as soon as possible. But the second he began blindly galloping through the forest away from this area, he began hearing whispers and heavy footsteps right behind him as if they were following him out of the forest. But Frank was so scared, he didn't even dare turn around to look. He just rode as fast as he possibly could. Hours later, Frank suddenly emerged from the dark forest, and just by absolute happenstance, he arrived right in the town that he and the other gold prospectors had passed through on their way out into the woods. And the moment Frank left the tree line and actually entered into this town, the whispering and the footsteps, which had basically chased him all the way to this point, they stopped. Suddenly, Frank was all alone. Now, by this point, Frank had convinced himself that everything he had heard in the woods, the voice telling him he was going to be tortured for what he'd done, the heavy footsteps, the whispering, the screaming, the moaning, all of it, everything that had caused him to flee was actually the ghost of Blackjack. That after he had killed his friend's spirit had immediately risen and sought revenge on Frank. That's what was happening. And this horrified Frank so much that he didn't care at all about the gold anymore. He just wanted to get out of the spiritual danger he thought he was in. And so as he rode into this village, all he looked for was a church. And when he found the church, he went to the front steps and he sat there waiting for the priest. At dawn, the priest finally arrived at the church and found Frank sitting there looking horrible, and Frank instantly stood up, rushed over to the priest, and began begging him to save him from Blackjack's ghost. Now, at first, as the priest listened to Frank tell his story about this ghost, he just thought that Frank was crazy. But once he got Frank to slow down and sort of go over the details step by step, the priest realized that perhaps there was some truth to this story. It sounded like it was probably true that Frank really did find a gold mine with his friend named Blackjack, and at some point, the discovery of this gold mine prompted Frank to murder Blackjack. But despite the fact that this man, Frank, had just openly confessed to a murder, the priest could only focus on the gold that apparently Frank had found out in the forest. It was like this intense feeling had come over the priest, this darkness that just made him suddenly so greedy. He had never felt this way before in his life, but it was like he was laser focused on finding a way to claim that wealth that was just out there right now. And so against all his better judgment, the priest turns to Frank and says, "You know what? We'll help you. But for right now, you need to get out of town. Get out of here. Don't come back. We'll go out, we'll find Blackjack, we'll give him a proper burial, and that will protect you from his ghost." And so Frank was so thankful to the priest and he took off, not realizing that the priest did not care at all about Frank at this point. All the priest cared about was getting Frank out of the picture so that that gold mine out in the woods could be his. The next day, the priest asked his friend, an outdoorsman named John McDougall, to head off into the wilderness to try to find Frank and Blackjack's campsite. And so that's what John did, and after a few hours of looking, he found the campsite. And sure enough, he found Blackjack's dead body still inside of the tent with the axe lodged in his head. And right away, John, the ever-loyal friend to the priest, began doing what the priest told him to do, which was to bury Blackjack to cover up the murder. Because the priest and John were planning to claim this gold mine for themselves, and they couldn't have this murder getting out to the public, because then officials would come out and investigate the scene, and then they would find the gold mine. They couldn't have that. And so John began digging a grave for Blackjack, and as he did, he began hearing whispers all around him in the trees. Remember, he's all alone out there. And so he began looking around, trying to figure out who's out here. Did somebody follow him? But there was no one. John did his best to keep trying to dig as quickly as he could, but these whispers, these awful voices, they just kept getting louder and more pronounced and closer to him, eventually to the point where John was spooked. I mean, John was this avid outdoorsman who routinely spent time by himself out in the wild, but here he was feeling very unsettled by these voices. But despite his fear, John did what he was told and dug the grave as fast as he could, grabbed Blackjack's body, threw him inside, he covered him up, and he put a couple of big stones on top of the gravesite to kind of make a makeshift tombstone. And then afterwards, again, despite feeling totally unsettled out here, John did the next part of the plan, which was to go look for gold, go to the stream, find the gold these guys were talking about. But as John is down by the water looking for gold, he began hearing more and more of those voices all around him. He kept spinning around, but nobody was there. And then finally, this awful high-pitched laughter cut through the trees. He whipped around. There was nobody there, but it was so terrifying that John just abandoned the search for gold and just hopped back on his horse and fled out of there. But within a couple of days, John and the priest had convinced themselves that those weird noises and that laughter that John had heard out there was just some bird, that it was all in John's head, he was spooked for no reason, when in reality, it was just that incredible pull of that gold being out there waiting to be claimed. It was like John and the priest, they couldn't not go looking for it. And so John decided to go back out into the woods, except this time he did not go alone. He brought a group of men with him. And so this group, led by John, retraced Frank and Blackjack's steps down that skinny trail all the way to their campsite. And when they got there, John just froze. He could not believe what he was seeing. The rocks that were sitting on the grave where John had just buried Blackjack were gone. These huge rocks just missing. And also, the tent, the bloodied tent where Blackjack had been murdered, had also been cleared. There was no trace of it anywhere. It was like the campsite had never existed. And this made no sense to John because he knows this is a totally isolated part of the wilderness. Like, nobody comes through here. Who in their right mind would just happen to pass by and randomly grab all these rocks and the tent covered in blood and take it out of here? It made no sense. Like, who could have done this? Now, until this point, John really had convinced himself that everything he'd experienced the time before was in his head. It was just a bird or, it was just normal forest sounds. And he also, like the priest, had convinced himself that Frank's original story about Blackjack's ghost chasing him out of the forest was just the ramblings of a crazy, guilty man. A murderer's guilty conscience had created that story. But now, as John was surveying the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but think, maybe this place is haunted. And so once again, John just turned and fled. He and the men, they got out of there as fast as they could, and when John got back to town, instead of going to the priest, he just went right to the bar and just started drinking. And he kept on drinking until he died of alcohol poisoning just a couple of days later. And John's death started a chain of unexplained catastrophes, all connected to this gold. First, the priest, after discovering what happened to John, didn't really spend any time grieving the loss of his friend. Instead, the priest just saddled up and headed out into the woods to find the gold himself. However, he found the trail that led out to the campsite and to the gold had been destroyed in a forest fire. Then, Lafayette French, the rich investor who had bankrolled the original expedition, he heard about the mine and decided he would go find it. However, the guide that he hired to take him there literally died on the way into the forest. By this point, French had heard all the stories about how, Blackjack's ghost was out in this forest haunting the area, preventing people from finding the gold. But French ignored all those stories. Just like with Frank and the priest and John, it was like that gold had an unbreakable hold on him. And so for 30 years, French kept going out into that forest, searching for that gold mine, and eventually he found it. Or at least that's what he said in the last letter he wrote back home. But we'll never actually know for sure, because after sending that letter, on that same day, Lafayette's cabin burned down and he died without telling anybody the location of the mine. And so with French's death, that sort of solidified the rumors that the haunting was real. And people began to believe that there was only one thing that could explain this almost magnetic pull the gold had on so many people, and also all the terrible fates that befell everybody who tried to go look for it. And that was that the gold mine was cursed. And today, people still believe that Blackjack's ghost is out there in the forest preventing people from finding the gold. But whatever the truth is, whether the curse is real or not, to this day, no one has ever been able to successfully find the gold again and live to tell about it.
I need space. I learned to walk alone in rooms full of doubt. Turn silence into armor, figure myself out. I don't chase attention, I let it come correct. If love knocks at my door, it better bring respect. I've been breaking patterns that were never mine, healing generations, one boundary at a time. I don't feel losing people who can meet me whole. I'd rather be alone than play a smaller role. I move with soft power, but my mind stays sharp. I love without losing any piece of my heart. I see the galaxies in your gaze, a quiet universe in silver haze. Every moment sparks a hidden light, a constellation burning through the night. And the world fades to gray, you pull the colors back my way, and every shadow disappears when your voice is what I hear. Stars in your eyes,
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.